I'm a firm believer that disease trends are the precursors of how people are going to eat. But the other thing is take a look at where we are technologically. So we're seeing a trend in this new generation, this generation alpha, of being more worldly in their eating habits, of wanting to try more food. Well, that's interesting you say with the spices and the pepper. So this generation alpha, they are a generation that will require more spices in their food and in what they want as they get older.
That's interesting. Welcome back to the Beet podcast. It is me, Jacques Lykov, the Garden Hermit, and today I'm interviewing Victoria Pardo Uzitas, and she is a food scientist who works on all sorts of interesting different projects. She actually is involved in a lot of interesting local projects around here in San Diego, including local charities. And we're going to talk about all sorts of interesting topics around food safety and everything in between. So welcome on to the podcast. Why don't you give us a little background about what you do and who you are?
Thank you, Jacques. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a longtime fan. I am a food scientist. I was classically trained in the Fortune 100 global food companies. And in the last decade, I've started my own business. It's Ubiquity Business, Soup to Nuts. And we launch food products in consumer packaged goods arena. So those are packages that you would see out in retail.
Oh, okay. Very cool. So is your background for food science sounds like you're very focused on food safety and like development of recipes that are also delicious, but also safe. So like what goes into that process of bringing in something like that for the consumer? Like a little quick spiel, I guess.
Well, I always considered food scientists. Now, we're getting this popularity because of foodies. But back in the day, food science is actually a interdisciplinary study at a university, usually in a college of agriculture and agricultural science. So it's your chemistry, your biology, your nutrition, your microbiology, and your food processing. And I always consider food scientists as the superheroes of the food business, because our number one goal, whether any part, because food scientists can realm from, controllers and quality and regulatory to developing products like I do. But our number one goal is to mitigate risk and always keep your food safe and good to eat and safe to eat.
Yeah. I think it's something that, as gardeners, I would assume that anyone who gardens is gardening because they want to grow food. I mean, you could, of course, garden to grow flowers and all sorts of landscaping. But if you're listening here, you're probably growing some amount of food to eat because we love gardening. And it's something that we often don't talk about or even honestly think about. We're so used to getting our produce from wherever we got it traditionally, like the grocery store or farmer's market. And a lot of it, like, I just don't think about food safety as much in my garden. I think there's certain things that I'm definitely aware of. Like, for instance, I have chickens. I know I have chicken manure. That is something that I'm hyper worried about. Like, I try to make sure that there's no manure in my compost that's like fresh, that's making its way onto the plants. But for like an average backyard gardener, like what are like the things like that is there anything like major that is a food safety concern, I guess, for a gardener?
You'd be very, very surprised. I've only been gardening. I want to thank you guys for allowing me to get into gardening, despite being on some of the largest farms in the world. I just began gardening in 2000 because my children, my eldest, loves parsley salads daily, and I could not get to the grocery store. My husband was in the hospital during COVID, running the COVID command center at hospitals, and I was solo, and my kid wanted parsley salads. And I found you guys and helped me develop my garden. And the number one thing is understand your surroundings. You understand that you have chickens. But let's start from the basics. Washing your hands. I do it a lot too. I work with my worms and my composting. You're then, digging in the dirt. You're then pulling out weeds. Is washing your hands often. Let's just start with the basics. The other thing is understanding your surroundings. What I discovered is when I first started, I have a slope in the back of my house, and I started cleaning out for a garden. And I found wires and construction material there that I found very concerning. And one of the things that I I planted tons of sunflowers. And the reason I planted sunflowers is because sunflowers are known to pull out metals and toxins, and especially in a lot of radioactive areas, they plant sunflowers as well. So understand
they're really good bioaccumulators.
And I wanted to do that before I even started with any foodborne. The next thing that a new gardener maybe is testing your soil. I don't know how many of us, because we live in San Diego, many of us live very close to neighbors, is testing what your soil, understanding what your local city or HOA, what type of spraying they're doing on their lawns when they are doing them. And then also our gloves. How many times are we washing our gloves or keeping?
Never.
Do you have do you keep separate gloves for your maintenance equipment? Do you keep separate gloves for harvesting?
I'm pretty bad about all of that, honestly. I have to admit.
It's one of those, and it is because my youngest would go out and eat things in the garden. And we have this false sense of security because we're growing our own food that automatically it's safe. My landscaper has goats and chicken and sheep, and he walks with the same shoes into my garden. So it's very important. It's so much more. It's more about mitigating the risks.
Yeah. For me, I think one thing that I've never really thought of course, like I think we all like to think of our gardens as like a perfect paradise that's like safe and we don't do anything to it. I don't spray anything. So like, how could anything bad happen? But then you remember, I'm like, I'm in a major city. I'm surrounded by freeways. There's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of black dust that builds up like on your windowsill inside, right? From outside. So of course that's getting on my service. Like there's just no way that things aren't landing on my produce outside. Like it's going to get dirty, and not just dirt, but like car pollution and smog and all sorts of things like that are just, they're kind of invisible, but they're there. Like, they're there because you clean your house. So those are the kind of things that I've thought about. And it's something to remind me to actually rinse my produce. And that's kind of where I've been. Like I usually don't wear gloves. I just don't like it. It just feels weird. I don't have a glove problem.
I have to tell you, that's actually better because if you wash your hands often,
I don't need to worry about cleaning my gloves.
You don't need to worry about the cross-contamination of the gloves. You mentioned chickens, animals. You forget about the birds we have overhead or the crows. I was feeding my grubs to crows because of that one of the episodes I watched. Animals carry parasites and bacteria and viruses. So it's not even our animals. So maybe it's a neighborhood cat. And we need to understand how that's getting into our food. And you mentioned a very, very thing that caught my eye is you said, rinse my food. And it's very important that we wash our food.
So let's talk about how to safely clean that produce, how to store it so we can actually enjoy it properly. So Victoria, last time I mentioned that I like to rinse my produce and then just eat it. Is there anything wrong with that? Am I safe? What's the deal?
Considering you do have chickens in your garden, I would always, and keep in mind, nothing is 100%. It's all about mitigating the risk. And for somebody healthy like yourself, you'll probably be fine. But there's a chance of cross-contaminating to somebody who may be immunocompromised. Whether you have grandparents or parents or maybe a young toddler, it's very just important to keep these things in mind.
I think that's actually a really nice introduction baseline, right? Is to think about, like, it might have not been a problem for you in the past because you're fine, but you might have to consider younger children maybe in the future or elderly parents or anything in between. So I think that's a great baseline to start.
Well, the other thing let's keep in mind is with cross-contamination of a lot of foodborne illnesses and many of the major ones that we've seen and resulted in deaths here in our country, it was never that some of these children, the ones I'm thinking of exactly, never actually consumed the product themselves. It was through cross-contamination that they end up getting sick. And eventually. So it may be something that the toddler or your elderly grandfather is not consuming themselves, but you then hence, through, using the same bathroom and maybe not being clean or a countertop could then affect them. So that's very important to note that you don't have to eat what has been compromised.
Now we have like a little bit of baseline background. So now let's do a hypothetical. I go outside. and I pick a bunch of tomatoes, maybe I grab a cucumber, some lettuce, wanting to make a salad. Like, what's my process to best wash that for my best results, basically?
Well, number one, we know that you've washed your hands because you don't use gloves. Number two,
starting off
that's
clean.
Great. So let's think about the container that you are putting them in. Is it a container that sits out in the garden that you put all your garden produce in?
It is. It is a harvest basket that I always leave outside and I never clean.
Yes. Do you put it in the dishwasher? So that's number two. Okay. It's just, believe me, after this, I'm going to stay in your mind, is ensuring that's clean. Throwing it into your dishwasher, washing it with some soap and hot water, some disinfectant on a regular basis and before you put food in it. Number two is, do you dump then all of it in your kitchen sink to rinse it off?
No, I will do all my rinsing first. I'll give you the honest way that I do it. I take my harvest basket, I walk over, I take my hose, I blast it with a bunch of water right off the bat. Then I bring it inside on a clean colander, and then I'll actually rinse it under the sink in my kitchen, usually just water. Maybe I'll just like rub it if it looks like it needs it. And then the lettuce, I'll soak in water, and then I'll spin it afterwards. But that's my basic procedure for cleaning produce as is.
Well, it's good that you're not throwing it into the sink because our sink harvests a lot of bacteria.
Oh, yeah. I don't mess with the sink at all.
Always a clean bowl. The other thing I was going to ask you is the shears that you're cutting your produce with. Do you have specific shears? I have specific shears just for my herbs and my lettuces, just because, and that gets washed every single time I use it. So your shears, is these the same ones that you're cutting things around the garden?
Yes. In general, it'll be whatever is near me. And then oftentimes it'll be my pocket knife if I'm collecting like some lettuce. Maybe I'm not collecting the whole plant. Or more often than not, honestly, I'm just ripping it off the plant. I'm just taking my hand, just popping that tomato off, or just twisting the lettuce out of the ground and then cutting the roots off. But yeah, that's basically what I'm doing. I don't have a separate set of shears, but I actually like that idea for herbs a lot in particular.
A scrub brush that's used solely for washing your vegetables that you put into the dishwasher to disinfect. The only reason I'm saying a dishwasher, there's other ways, there's hot water ways of cleaning it. But for us, we just default to the easiest thing possible. I do recommend scrubbing, whether it looks clean, it's not what we can see that's actually could be harmful. We want to scrub that. As for lettuce, with anything, I keep a spray bottle of vinegar. So it's a great disinfectant, especially during COVID when we couldn't get other things. That's what I was cleaning just everything with. Spraying it down and letting it sit. You can actually soak it in a vinegar solution and water as well. I use, and I don't know, this is where it defaults to, I use salt as well because I feel the little bugs just tend to float up like the Dead Sea. A nice mixture of salt on there because I feel like then I can see what's coming off of my plants and the slugs as well. But I do let it sit for a few minutes. I know we're all in a hurry, but don't be rushed. And then once again, soak it again. With the tomatoes and cucumbers, I always peel my cucumbers just because I have picky children. And then because the ones you get from the grocery store, but make sure to use a scrub brush, even if you can't see anything with something. And I spray it directly. I spray it directly on everything, even on my citrus that you keep in a nice bowl and then you eat. Well, I'm not eating the skin, but you're touching the skin and it's dripping and the juice is going on the outside. So vinegar is very important. I think it's just a great go-to. It's natural.
I have two things there. First, I'll share. I actually remember reading stories about, like, for example, Chipotle, when they make guacamole, they got salmonella. And it turns out it's because they weren't washing the avocados. And so when they cut the avocados, the skin went into the fruit. And then they made guacamole. And that's how it got contaminated. So it's definitely, like, possible. I've definitely heard that story before.
Cut fruit is another one that I try to avoid from the grocery store. I do wash even people like watermelon. How many are you just cutting into the watermelon?
Or give it a little scrub relief.
Just spray with a little vinegar. Scrub it up. Make sure that it's more than just a rinse of just washing it, like you would like washing a dish.
And a couple things about the vinegar is it won't make your produce taste like vinegar. It won't make it taste weird. I've done it. It's totally fine. Don't worry about that. The other nice thing about the salt and vinegar bath is especially for things like if you've ever grown homegrown broccoli or cauliflower, they got a lot of nooks and crannies. And when you put them in that solution, like you said, like caterpillars will just float away. Even things like aphids will actually just kind of let go because they can't handle it. So they're just going to essentially float off, and then you'll end up with clean produce. So not only is it good at cleaning other contaminants, but you're totally right. Like if you've ever had that head of broccoli where you're like, man, I want to eat it so bad, but there's like enough aphids in there that I don't feel comfortable, hit it with a little bit of that vinegar and saltwater solution. They'll all disappear and you'll end up with your beautiful homegrown broccoli. So I think that's definitely a great general cleaning solution across the board. And then harvesting shears. I think having a nice set that you could use for herbs in particular, things that you're using all the time where you're eating a lot of the plant itself and it's delicate. And I think you said that you even throw yours into a dishwasher every once in a while just to keep them clean.
And also mine allow me to, it has a side thing to be able to like cut the herbs like the parsley or the thyme on the side of the shear that I have. Mm-hmm. And I have 2 pair. So I know which one, and after I do it, and it goes straight into the sink as if I just used a dirty dish.
Very cool. And then in terms of like preserving our harvest, let's like on the most basic note, let's say something like lettuce. Let's say I just harvested a head of lettuce. How do if I don't want to eat it right now, but I need to harvest it and store it in my fridge, what are some suggestions you have for people at home?
You know, as a society, we tend to delay things, and we come home from the grocery store and we tend to throw everything into our refrigerator. What I would highly recommend, if it's possible, is ensuring that anything that goes into your refrigerator is cleaned. I started this when I first had children because I wanted my children to be able to just go and grab the vegetables. My kids are huge vegetable eaters. It was designed that way from a young age of what I introduced to them. They did not get fruit until much later because it's delicious. Yeah. But I wanted to be able for them to just go into the refrigerator and just grab whatever, and it was okay to eat. Also having a separation on how you keep bins, those clear bins. Now we're seeing like everybody having these compartments in the refrigerator because of organization, being able to keep things separate and already washed. Your meats, just think about it. Your meats are not only, they're wrapped and they're sitting there, but they're also sitting on top of other meats in the grocery store, of just wiping that down and ensuring that it is in a closed bin that then you can get. So it's not like it's going to drip on anything or your lettuce or tomatoes, just keeping that separate and lower on the shelves if possible, because then the higher, then you're preventing anything from like dripping down as well.
Right.
And then just wiping those down, of keeping that safely. Now, remember, when it comes to bacteria, it's all about your water content. So with your lettuces, I always liked everything wash. And I tend to use a paper towel to wrap them in before putting them into a container. Yeah. It does stay fresh. It's actually stayed fresh for like 3 weeks, shockingly. Yeah. Because I've opened it up and I'm like, wait, this lettuce is fantastic.
Yeah, actually, that's a great tip for cucumbers also. If you just put even just a sheet of paper towel in the bag with your cucumbers, they will last probably twice as long, just because of that moisture not being able to sit up on the actual vegetable, which then leads to it rotting. So in general, I actually would encourage this. In the past, when we used to get a CSA box before the garden really started producing a bunch, what we would do is we set up an outdoor sink, we got all the produce and we washed it all, laid it on clean towels, let it dry, and then put it all in the fridge. And that's kind of something we haven't done as well lately, just because there's just so much going on. Like you said, like everything is busy. There's always something to distract you. But I think that's a great idea, something to practice across the board. Keeps your fridge cleaner, keeps your produce lasting longer. And especially if you have kids, I love that example because they will just go in there and they will just eat something. They're not thinking about where has this carrot been, who touched it, was it on the ground, was it in the grocery store? They just want to eat a carrot. So I love that idea, especially if you have children, keeping your produce clean in there and making it a policy that just go in there and eat whatever you want and it's fine. So that's awesome.
You know, especially so 2 things, especially for children, what I found is if you have things already cut up, I purchased this container and I can't seem to find it again. It has different compartments. So all I would need to do is take out the tray because, of course, being a food scientist, you have picky kids that don't like the same thing. So they had all their different fruits and vegetables laid out. So I could just take it out and they can just open one container. So you're more likely to eat more if you're not having to be like, I want blueberries, but I also want carrots. And you're just opening one thing and everything's washed and cut up into sizes that they'd like. Is one of the things that I would recommend.
Well, that was really interesting. I think I will probably be thinking about it a little bit more and maybe starting up my own little spray bottle with vinegar. Do you have like a dilution or like a ratio off the top of your head by chance? Or is it something you can look up?
I use a spray bottle for mine, and I spray onto the actual produce, and then I just pour some, about a quarter of a cup, into the water. But because I spray it directly on, I make sure it stays on.
Oh, so it's direct 5% vinegar?
I do it direct because I keep it under. It's just easier for me to pour. Yeah. And then I fill it with water, and then I usually, but I spray it directly onto the produce because I feel like it's the best.
No, that makes total sense. So food safety scientist mind, like, what are you thinking about when you're going out and selecting products for your garden where you know you're going to be eating that food?
Well, this is a learning curve for me as a first-time gardener. And just finding these things in my garden of, from construction of my home and then neighbors. And I wanted to find things that you find things that are on discount. You find them on the internet. You find things that come directly to your door. So I wanted to go to a reputable source. And I did my research. And this is actually, I think this is what led me to following you guys later on, is your birdie bed, which is the side of my house. Because and many of the neighbors have tomatoes, things right up to the side of their home. And I didn't feel comfortable having a garden 20 feet in my backyard, let alone planting items that my family was going to consume next to my home. And that's where your birdie beds came in. You could do some research, but trust companies like the Epic Gardener in your shop to know that, number one, is it food grade?
Right.
Number two is we live in a hot climate, or even if you live in a cold climate, the decomposition of the paints and the surfaces on these items as well. Is it going to leach into your food? And many times you're like, oh, well, that one is, X amount more. But think about the quality of what you're going to be growing in there. Is it going, and then you're like, let's say you're not growing edible plants in there, but is it going to leach into the other items in your garden? Which you would be very, very surprised how many, when asked the question. Recently, I just had somebody out. I was sold. This is what I wanted. And then I asked them what type of plastic it is. And they had questions and couldn't answer. This was the source. This is the manufacturer. So ask questions.
Gotcha.
No, but purchase items from a reputable source, people who've done their research. And then also be careful in those big stores where you are buying your plants and your seeds that are, and the plastic just falls apart as soon as you take the plant out. And it's basically, disintegrating in your hands. Exactly. What is that sending off to your plants?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there for sure I wanted to touch on. The first was, you mentioned you didn't feel comfortable growing up right next to your house. Now, for me, what comes to mind when I think of that is my house, for example, is old. It's over 100 years old, or it's near, it's 100 years old. So in that time process, almost without a doubt, somebody used lead paint. Like, it's probably impossible to say that they didn't. I'm just going to assume, like, I have lead test kit actually been meaning to do, but part of me doesn't want to because I'm scared. But I wouldn't do it right next to my house because I know it's not a good reason. Because of course, like, if you're repainting a house, like, it's going to drip, it's going to break down, and that's going to be right up on the boundaries. Is there something else that you think about when you're thinking near house gardening?
Well, it's not even lead paint. Also think of the asbestos, think about the glues, think about, when the EPA came about and the age of your home. And even if you have a modern home, my home is 11 years old, you have all the plastics that are now in manufacturing, the treated wood so you don't get termites, and so forth. Even garden beds made of wood, and people are just like, oh, it's a treated wood, it's not going to fall apart. Well, I prefer replacing my bed in 5 years because there's not a chemical in it to keep it, formaldehydes to keep it,
Absolutely.
around for 50 years.
Yeah. And then the other thing about the Birdie's beds, not to go too deep on our own product, but it is something that it's family made company. They use like green solar power. They get their source. Their steel is like they're manufacturing in Australia. They have supply chains regulations. There's rules that they have to play by to make the products in those countries and then to bring them over to here. Whereas other places, maybe manufacturing practices aren't as strict. Maybe there aren't as many regulations, and you don't actually know like what is going into that paint, what is going into that metal. And it's kind of like a weird thing. Like it's almost like a boogeyman that you can't see, but it's a real thing. Like it's something that's very popular right now. In particular, I think more people are aware of all the different levels of contamination that can happen. And like you said, it's not just lead. It could be like your treated woods. It could be like your PFASs and like plastics that are breaking down. And so for me, it's actually something I think about a lot. So when I use a wooden bed, for example, I just put in a new cedar bed. It's naturally more rot resistant. But then to compound that, I didn't want to use varnish. I didn't want to use any polyurethanes because that's going to break down. All that plastic's going to just end up in my soil where I'm literally growing my food. So I did the method where I burned it using fire to create like a charcoal surface, which helps it become like less permeable to water. So there's ways around all of these things that have now been created to make our lives a little bit easier. And one of the things in particular that I'm trying to avoid is like, I'll never do a landscape plastic because I know it's going to break down. It's not going to last forever. It's going to shred into microplastics, and it's also going to leach into your soil. So there's a lot of like shortcuts in life that seem really appealing on paper. And then 5 years later, you're going to highly regret it. You're not going to have a good time when you have to deal with those problems. And I think the reputability of who you're buying from, the trust, and just thinking even a little bit about the materials you're choosing because you're eating it. Like this is what's going into your body. It's like your source of calories, your building blocks for life. And you don't want to be eating something that's contaminated. So I think it's definitely something I think about. And I think it's also something a lot more people are thinking about these days.
And just having that second thought of just also like looking at your surroundings too. I can go on with birdie beds forever, but I mentioned how I didn't feel comfortable there, but the plants that I actually have in my birdie beds, and I have a retaining wall that also has a tree, same trees. The one in my birdie bed is significantly healthier. And they both have the same kind of soil, but one's in a concrete retaining wall that has a plastic liner that I didn't really get to choose on a wood treated fence. And it's here. So it's also the outcome of the produce that you get from having it in something that is, food grade, that's been tested from a reputable source.
Yeah. And then another thing you mentioned earlier, like, for example, let's say we are cleaning our gardening products and our shears and resharpening them and all that sort of stuff. Like, what do you do in terms of trying to keep, because there's all sorts of crazy things you could use to clean rust. But personally, I just use vinegar and just let that do the work. Is there something else that you think about when you're thinking about like the actual tools that you're using in the garden?
So number one, make sure that it is what I use for tools, and think about your lawnmower. Think about, those, and I don't know that this is your game. This is your lane of the shears that cut off, the branches, the electric ones. And
yeah.
Not a chainsaw, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So so you're doing all this for your garden, you're growing it organically, and you have your worm castings, but then you're putting chemicals in the equipment that you're then cutting everything in your garden with. So what I always recommend is look at an NSF certified lubricant or silicone, an H1. So H1 so they have different letters and numbers that correspond with their uses. H1 is the minimum. It's for incidental food contact.
I see.
And yeah, so when you're looking at the can, if it's not NSF registered, that's number one. And number two, they should have some type of letter designation with the NSF symbol on it as well. you want to make sure that these are, and think about it in food production too. We keep these chemicals. These chemicals can be kept in a separate container and not what with the other chemicals that aren't NSF registered H1 that have to be kept off the floor. Why should your garden be any different?
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the other things, for example, that I have been doing to keep my garden soil safe, for me in particular, is I've been just avoiding cardboard. I don't want to, I don't have any hard facts to give you guys today and studies off the top of my head, but I've read a lot about it in the past. You don't know how that paper was recycled, what that paper originally was, what it was used for, what kind of binders and glues go into. Like, there's, of course, cardboard that's very clean and honestly probably totally fine. But there's just too much of a chance for something random to get into my garden, even just like a pesticide, like in terms of like even less directly safety wise. But I've had compost from the municipal source that's had like herbicide in it. I spread it and then nothing can grow. Like, so there's things that you could do to your garden that aren't just going to affect the safety of your food, but they also might stunt it for years and also make it so you don't want to eat that food. So it is something that you definitely, it's worth thinking about. It's worth, like, of course, there's always going to be budgetary limits, but I highly encourage everyone to think about it at least a little bit and try not to make too much of a commitment that might be too hard to undo later on because you wanted to save a little bit of money, which I totally understand, but it's just...
I have a fun fact about cardboard. Many U.S. cardboard manufacturers are moving over to H1 food grade lubricants on their production line in manufacturing, because what they're finding is they don't really know where unless of course you're making a pizza box, then you know it's going to go to food. But some of them don't know where their cardboard eventually is going to end up in.
Oh, I never even thought about all the cardboard for food.
So now there's a movement for many cardboard manufacturers, and one of the largest, of moving over their production line maintenance, lubricants and oils, repair oils, over to food grade products. So it's interesting. So they're cognizant of that as well. However, you don't know where your cardboard is coming from normally, and you forgot to mention the glues and binders and dyes and inks that are also used, because most cardboard is just not plain cardboard. There's some kind of printing that may seem organic because it looks like a paper bag. That also has to decompose inside of your garden.
I see. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot to think about there. So the basics for you guys is do a little bit of research, ask questions. If you're curious, you'll generally find the answers, or maybe you won't find an answer and that's the answer you need to not use something. And, trust goes a long way. So if company's been around a while, like, it'll help a bit, but just think about it. Don't make any decisions that might hurt you later on, just to save you a little bit of money up front, even though it's very tempting. I get it. It's tempting for me every day, but you still have to think about it, and a little bit of pain might end up paying you off in the long run big time. So the next one, I think we're going to switch it up a little bit, and let's get into like something a little bit more fun that we can maybe drink, maybe a little bit of garden cocktails. I think you've had a long history of making very interesting cocktails, so why don't you kick it off?
Yes, well, I had one of my bucket list items have always been, when I first became a food scientist 26 years ago, was to have a cocktail column. And this is when people read magazines in print. And I was lucky enough to have one under the pen name Libation Lady. Because of that, I just got to explore a little bit more of trends. So one of the things that my specific type of food science is I look at research and develop what's the next trend in food. And this was, maybe 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. And I had mentioned before the boom of kombucha that hard kombuchas were going to be on trend, and same with shrubs in making anything raw, fermented, really good for gut health. We're seeing a lot more GI diseases on the incline. And these are all items that we're going to continue to grow. But shrubs is great to have in your fridge at all times. By the way, this is kept in my outdoor fridge as it ferments, because they do tend to have release of carbon dioxide. So it's just kind of easy because it has exploded all over me, and it's nothing like smelling like vinegar, but they're
Oh yeah. Yeah,
delicious.
actually one of the things it's something we do occasionally. We'll do like a basic infusion. So for me, when I say infusion, I'm thinking some sort of spirit, whether it's something neutral like vodka or even something that already has flavor like a whiskey, and infusing it with different maybe fruits, herbs, whatever we have in the garden. Like we a lot of times like using tulsi, calamansi from our tree for citrus. But there are actually, it's something we've thought about in the past, I want to say, because, for example, we wanted to get roses. We wanted to get a rose that was highly aromatic because when you're doing food stuff with roses, you want basically the most aromatic one. That's going to be the one that transfers most to food. And so we did some research and we found it has to be organic. If it's not organic, then you have to treat it as organic for a few years before you even want to use those petals. So we started off with an organic rose that we've, of course, been growing organically so that we know when we actually collect those petals and make something out of it, it's clean and safe. Because rose production, I am sure, based on the stories of people battling with diseases on roses, that those things get sprayed like crazy. And probably with pesticides and herbicides and other things in between. So I'm sure you have some thoughts on
It
that
was, so I did make a Valentine's cocktail that was a rose petal chocolate liqueur that I always like to give the teachers on Valentine's Day. And that was one of the challenges that I found was to find organic roses, rose petals from a reputable source. I ended up going with a neighbor who was a longtime gardener who gave me. What's interesting, you said the most aromatic roses, but sometimes when you do infuse the most aromatic roses, they tend to be perfumey because think about how you make perfume.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
Also, also separating the petals from the rose hip and the core and infusing those separately depending on your taste. And with rose petals, they're not infused in whatever spirit that you would like, usually like you mentioned, a vodka or a cleaner one. Not very long because you don't want it to fall into that cusp of being too perfuming and too that acidic taste. And that's why I liked the chocolate with it because the chocolate and the milk from it balanced. So we did some milk and some chocolate into the vodka and made it into a softer liqueur. And it's one of the most delicious. I do prefer the white. The white chocolate was better just because you could see that pinkish tone to it. It was very Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
One way, a lot of people use the dried roses, but keep in mind, most of them, you're right, the pesticides, you don't know where it's sourced. You know, they're selling you a big 1 pound of dried rose petals. And you
for
just
like a couple bucks. It's like, how is it possible?
Yeah, for a couple of bucks. Exactly. So ensure that it's your best getting a neighbor gardener who does roses, who, you know, that's what they do, and asking them for a few.
Yeah. And then for cocktail stuff, I usually will just collect like whatever herbs we have that look good right now and just make all sorts of unique things. And generally, I will, of course, make sure that I wash those before using them. Even though it is, of course, in alcohol, we're not only sanitizing like bacteria, right? There's all sorts of things we don't want in our drinks. So making sure to clean all those guys up nicely is probably also a good idea.
But also reducing the water content. So that's the thing. You want to reduce the water content. You don't want to just, you're freshly washed. Ensure it's significantly dried. I know some of them will even dehydrate. You could dehydrate it before infusing, but I do have a trick that I like to use at Halloween to infuse spirits with Halloween candy, but it parlays to the garden. So infusion takes, so infusion takes days, and you have to shake it and you have to keep it in a hard spot and you forget about it. And so one of my favorite infusions is jalapenos in tequila because you get that spice. Actually, I have a few signature drinks that people ask me for, but one of them is my smoked spicy mango jalapeno.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
And so what I do is I do take the fresh mango and I do puree that. A lot of
Oh,
people
okay.
like to strain it, but I just like that thickness of the mango. In my cocktails, some people like a really clean cocktail, and that's up to them. But I do infuse the jalapeno, but I really tend to forget, be like, oh, it's, I am. So my trick is, and I do this for Halloween for a lot of parents, is I will take the jalapenos. You can leave the seed. I always remove the seed because they do have more
Yeah.
water content.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I make sure it's sealed in a screw top and I put it into the dishwasher for a cycle. And
Oh,
so it's run it for a cycle. It's really just the heat process.
yeah.
And then you take it
Interesting.
and I got it and then I put it straight into the deep freezer. Make sure it's not so hot. You're rinsing it with water.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then now you have it in 2 hours versus having to spend a week to infuse your
Oh,
jalapenos.
okay. That's actually really
Your
cool.
tequila.
A little dishwasher hack there.
And you could, yeah, and you can do that trick with Halloween candy, with Jolly Ranchers, with Fireball. You can make your own Fireball whiskey, but that's one of my little tricks on infusion if
That's
you
a good
don't
one.
have the 5 to 7
Yeah.
days.
And then I'd love, so shrubs are, we've actually literally last week, me and my partner were like, why are we making shrubs? And she's probably going to do it, but because she really wants it. But I'd love to hear even like, I know a shrub is a vinegar based drink, and that's about it. So like, can you give like a very basic, like first shrub, most basic process? What goes in it? What does it mean? Why are we drinking it?
All right. So shrub is a sweetened fruit syrup that's preserved in vinegar. It's been around for thousands of years. It had an upswing in England in the 17th century. However, it really is indigenous people throughout the world that have really done some form of making some type of fermented fruit.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense. It's just going to be
yeah,
like almost a natural consequence of having too much fruit.
ex- exactly, because it's going to spoil and ferment and
Yeah.
so forth. Um, so a lot of the drinks that you're seeing now in the mixology world are made with an ounce or two of shrub. Now you can drink it directly, but I like it to use it more as a mixer. And you could
Okay.
keep different jars. And by the way, you do know with your mason jars, it's just like canning as well. You want to make sure that that's disinfected.
Yeah.
And it's 1/3 of the fruit. I tend to do more, just because I just do. It's one
Mhm.
third sugar and then 1/3 vinegar.
Oh,
If you
okay.
use
Wow.
if you use a kombucha vinegar, you need twice as much vinegar because the
So if you do
acidity
like
is not as high. Yes,
apple
that's what,
cider
you know
vinegar.
what? I use the apple cider. People like the cleaner, but apple cider is the one that I go to. It does have a little bit thicker. I like the fermentation. The best thing
Mhm.
is the shelf life on there. You'd be surprised how much longer it stays in your fridge. You could have whatever fruit that you want, whether it's your mango or citrus or berries. And then now let's say you have 10 different kinds. Somebody comes over and you can mix it up with whatever spirit that you like and then
Oh,
serve it over on a hot,
oh,
refreshing
interesting.
day. And now you have something that is a probiotic. I
Yeah.
mean, there's like
Yeah.
debates there with the alcohol, what percent is
Yeah.
actually being killed, but still, I believe I'm drinking a probiotic.
Yeah.
And it's just really delicious. You can also play with the sugars. So I have to, and I think I mentioned this before the podcast. I love beet sugar. It is the rock beet sugar is my go-to. It's like my treat when I have it in places. But there's coconut sugars and
Oh, yeah.
Demaria sugar. There's different sugars that have like less processing. So that can also play on the flavor of what you
Interesting.
prefer in your shrub.
So third fruit, third sugar, third of the vinegar, and then once you mix all that up, you put it in the fridge, right?
Put it in
Is
the
that where you
fridge,
keep it
yes.
at all times? Okay.
I keep mine in the fridge. There's people that do keep it out. I just keep mine in the fridge because I'm going to forget about it.
Yeah, it's gonna last
Um,
longer no matter what.
and and I just keep it. It does kind of affect the fermenting on it, but it's just easier for me because then you don't need it then you don't have to use it like in the 3 days.
Yeah, I think this is actually something I'm going to try to get Kevin to do because he has a peach tree that's covered in peaches, and there's too many. So maybe we'll make a little peach shrub here and see how that turns out. I still don't have too much fruit at my house. I have fruit trees planted, but I'm not swimming in it yet. So it might be a future project for me.
I'm going to make a
Yeah.
recommendation before he makes the peach shrub to cook the peaches on the barbecue or to smoke them before
Oh,
he puts them in, because you're going to get
okay.
more of that smoky and earthy flavor in your cocktails. So it would go really well with the type of whiskey. But I'm a whiskey drinker, so I tend to
Yeah, I was gonna say
go that
same, my partner would also
route.
probably love that. So that might be on the
It's
menu in this future coming week here. Shrubs are something that you can make with all sorts of different things from your garden, whether it's like even just using some herbs to like dress up whatever you already have going in there. So I highly encourage you guys to try that. And actually, speaking of shrubs being in right now, so we're going to be talking about like future trends in food, gardening, flavors, all about that stuff. So, and this is actually something that you're well versed in because you work a lot with these companies, not just in food safety, but like product development for consumer goods on these things. So you kind of have a roadmap, like you could see where things are going, like the shrubs in the past being popular today. You saw that coming. So what's on your horizon now as you're looking around?
Well, it's very important to note that we do a lot of research here. We do a lot of research, and one of the things I do, my husband is in healthcare, so I tend to follow this. I look at disease processes and I look at disease trends because I'm a firm believer that disease trends are the precursors of how people are going to eat. But then
Oh,
also,
that's smart.
so that's like on a broad scale of trends. But the other thing is take a look at where we are technologically. And I'm just going to take my youngest child. You know, you and I growing up, our parents growing up, we didn't have access to talking to people across the world or playing a game with them like my child does. So we're seeing a trend in this new generation, this generation alpha, of being more worldly in their eating habits, of wanting to try more food.
And then, so in that regard, it's actually interesting too, because I think in the gardening world, it's also kind of true, right? People want to grow more exotic, like to them, like spices or herbs. Like, for example, ginger and turmeric have been extremely popular in the garden these past couple of years. People have loved growing them. So, like, maybe there's a little bit of mirroring there as well.
Maybe you can give me some tips on it, because so this is my kryptonite, and I have a side of, it's either rotting or dry ginger on the side of my house that I try to get it to take, and
Yeah.
I can. But you're right, we're seeing this change. I personally like to grow things that somebody has never experienced. My other one
Yeah.
is my finger lime.
Oh, yeah.
And
Those are cool.
being able, um, well, yes, if I actually had one and it's been, that
Yeah.
would be amazing. A curry plant, the curry leaf plant.
Oh, yeah.
Is that, I do have a Buddha hand. It gave me 1 in 5 years of
Nice.
being able to use that zest. But there is, in gardening, you're going to see like things that are just being able to grow all over the world now with greenhouses and other technologies in the garden.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
able to have some of the things we normally wouldn't even have.
Yeah. And I think the other thing there is that, of course, like just having the option to grow something unique that maybe you can't even find at the grocery store, like some of the peppers and the herbs. And I mean, honestly, most of the produce I'm growing, I can't buy it if I went to the store and got it. So for me, like, I think that's kind of a trendy, fun thing is the exclusivity of like my garden, like the exclusivity of my harvest, because nobody else has that harvest. Nobody else can replicate what I'm pulling out of the garden. And that's just like a totally unique thing that they just don't have.
Well, that's interesting you say with the spices and the pepper. So this generation alpha, which is it's where my youngest child falls into, is what is leading this spice trend. You see it in popular
Oh,
snacks and
yeah,
chips, but they are a generation that will require more spices in their food and in what they want as they get older, because now at a
that's
very
interesting.
young age of single digits are enjoying this spice that I was exposed to it, but many did not have that exposure.
That's super interesting. And then in terms of like the other trends, I think you were mentioning that there was some other kind of what was on the horizon? Like people are actually being the
Not only do we have number one this global food
yeah
trends, because now we have exposure to friends all over the world now with the spice
we're
trend, but we also have foods that make some type of environmental impact that are
oh
able to
okay
change. It's interesting because this was now 6 years ago, and my daughter, who is in high school, will say, most of my friends remember you when you came to the elementary school and you talked about food and trends, and they haven't seen cricket flour on the market. So I mean, it's
yeah
sustainable, especially in areas where food insecurity
yeah
is
absolutely
exceptionally high. Um, you know, is and having an environmental impact of being able to be, grown versus, other methods of protein and meat production, cricket flour.
absolutely like that kind of stuff is not only it's it just sounds weird, but it's more sustainable. It's a great source of these proteins that we can't otherwise get. And personally, I think what a lot of people are also seeing, because I have to be on social media all the time as part of what I'm doing. So I end up consuming a lot of content that's also related to cooking. It seems like a lot of people are also interested in like the basics. Like maybe I don't like they love the international flavor and like all this uniqueness, but they also just want like something simple that they could put together in their home. And that's one of my favorite things about gardening, kind of tying all the things that we talked about, is that you could set and follow your own trends in your garden by growing whatever you want. But also you have the environmental impact to some extent of like not being able to like bring in like curry leaves from India. Like now it has to come from somewhere else, and now you have a little bit more control of your destiny, your sourcing, the cleanliness of your food. And it's also for me, like I started gardening because I love eating. I love eating straight out of the garden, simple recipes. So that's what I'm growing. I'm growing exactly what I want to consume on a day-to-day basis. And I think a lot of people who maybe started off gardening for fun or maybe for beauty are now also starting to realize, like, you know what? I don't need to grow 5,000 things. I want a lot of delicious tomatoes so I could make myself a tomato sandwich every day for summer. So I don't know if that's something that you've seen, but I think simplicity is maybe coming back a little bit.
It's a back to basics. It's something that's been on trend for the last 10 years. You've seen it in packaging of like less than 5 ingredients, of just keeping it simpler. We're also going back to ancient times, ancient grains and
Yeah.
rices, the heirloom variety. I mean, there are seeds now that have been really not extinct, but really not seen in mass, that are now making resurfacing on these, variety of fruits that haven't been really planted in 100 years, but somebody was able to propagate these rare. So there is a back to basics approach. The trend on just keeping it simple, less is more, for sure, is continuing to. But things that happen, like having a garden, and you see this because I do live in a community where you have like plastic lawns and concrete.
Yeah.
Listen, but being able to have that garden that then just temperature wise, if you saw me
Oh
versus
my God.
my
Yeah.
neighbor, it is significantly, especially the summer, of what the temperature variation is. A landscaper just said, "Oh my gosh," because I still have wild grasses because I haven't cut anything down. Like it's unbelievable how much cooler it is in your yard.
Yeah. No,
Um,
it's truly amazing. Like it's something that I don't think I've even mentioned as a benefit to people before. But my yard is so much cooler now than we started gardening. There's all that the evaporation and the plants are just breathing, they're creating oxygen and all the water exchange and everything, the shade that they're producing, not having concrete or bare dirt collecting heat all day. It's incredible. It's truly an incredible thing to have in your garden. So I love that. I think all of this has been super fascinating just to think about safety of food, like where it's going, how do we do better for ourselves in our own yards. It's been really pleasure having you on today and learning all about this. And maybe we'll have you back again in the future because this was a lot of fun to talk about all of this different thing. I'm just learning over here. So thank you.
This was a dream come true for me. I am a huge fan, and having this opportunity has really been a pleasure. So I do look forward to the opportunity, and I wish you guys the best of luck.